Okay, so for us to be successful today on simplifying complex numbers, we need to be able to graph the complex numbers, then add and subtract them. So first, let's find out what a complex number is. Even before we do that, we will talk about imaginary numbers. So to introduce us to imaginary numbers, we're going to solve this quadratic function. X squared plus 36 equals 0. So the first step to do that is we need to isolate whatever's being squared, which means we're going to subtract 36 from both sides. We get x squared equals negative 36. And then to undo that the square, we're going to square root it. I'm sorry? So here we end up with x equals plus or minus the square root of negative 36. Now, if you were to put square root of negative 36 into your calculator, it would tell you that it's a non-real solution. But because it's a non-real solution doesn't mean there isn't a solution. The solutions are just non-real or imaginary. So putting an arrow at the negative solutions or negative square roots are possible. We refer to them as non-real and imaginary numbers. Use I to represent them. So I means imaginary. And I is equal to the square root of negative 1. And from imaginary numbers, we can get complex numbers. And all of these are super fancy sounding words, but they're not. They're not at all fancy. So complex numbers are numbers that are made from a real number, and a real number is any number, plus or minus an imaginary number. We use A to represent a real number. And then we're going to do plus or minus. And then my imaginary number, remember we use the I. And then we also use a B as its coefficient. And just like any other expression that we've done with plus and minus, this just means we have A plus BI and A minus BI. Any questions so far? All right, so now let's learn how to graph it. When we graph complex numbers, your x-axis is going to represent our real axis, or our A. The y-axis is going to represent my imaginary axis, which is my BI. All right, so let's go ahead and sketch my axis, where my y-axis is my imaginary axis. And my x-axis is my real axis. And I'm going to use two little lines and then an R to label it. You don't have to, but I like to label my axis. So that's going to be R for real, and this one I'm going to label it I for imaginary. All right, so let's do our first example. I'm going to graph 2 plus 3i. So 2 is my real axis. So I'm going to go here on my x-axis, 1, 2. And then, oops, my positive 3i, we're going to plot it on my imaginary axis. So it's positive, so we go 1, 2, 3. This is 3. So here is 2 plus 3i. Questions so far? Okay, we're going to graph 2 more. Okay, so for example number 3, I have my x and y axis. Actually, it's example number 2, sorry. This is my real axis, my imaginary axis, and I'm going to plot -5 minus 8i. So my real number is -5. So on my x-axis, I'm going to go -1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So that's -5. And then on my imaginary, we've got -8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And so my point is here at -5, -8i. Okay, so for the next one, go ahead and plot 3 minus 4i. Okay, so the 3 is going to be on your x-axis. It's positive. So 1, 2, 3. And the -4 is on your y-axis. 1, 2, 3, 4. So it's this point right here is at 3 minus 4i. Any questions on graphing complex numbers? We're almost done, I promise. All right, so for the next one, or the next part, we're going to be adding and subtracting complex numbers. We're first going to add complex numbers. Now, when we add, we're going to first drop the parentheses. So let's say we're adding -6 plus 7i plus, this is adding 4 minus 6i. So if we drop our parentheses, we're basically combining like terms. What I like to do is I like to write them like terms under each other. So I'm going to rewrite the first complex number without the parentheses. And then I'm going to write the second number right under it. So this one is here. This one is here. And all I have to do is add them. Negative 6 plus 4 is negative 2. 7i minus 6i is positive 1i or positive I. And that's it. Okay, let's go ahead and you guys do one. So this is your you do. Do 3 minus 6i plus 1 minus 4i. So we are adding. So when we add, we want to just drop the parentheses and then rewrite them on top of each other. So 3 minus 6i and 1 minus 4i. You get 4 minus 10i. So if you got 4 minus 10i, you are correct. Let me know if you have any questions about adding complex numbers. All right, now we're going to subtract, and that's the last thing. So we're going to subtract complex numbers. Now when we subtract subtract complex numbers, the first thing we want to do is we're going to write the opposite of the second complex number. So do you guys remember in middle school when you started learning about minus? It was always the opposite, right? If you said 3, the opposite of 3 is negative 3. The opposite of positive 3, I'm sorry, negative 3 is positive, and the opposite of negative is positive. So that's basically what this minus sign is doing. It's doing the opposite of that number. So what we're going to do is we're going to rewrite the first one exactly the way it is, and then we're going to do the opposite of the second one. So instead of positive 4, we're going to do minus 4. And instead of negative 7i, we're going to do positive 7i. And then we add. 7 minus 4 is 3. 3 plus 7 is 10. Any questions? Go ahead and try this one. 10 minus 7i minus 3 plus 2i.